MC Mutual inició en el año 2021 el proyecto 360 PRL, abordando la prevención con perspectiva de género, para visibilizar la importancia de incorporar la perspectiva de género en la práctica de la prevención de los riesgos laborales. Dentro del marco de este proyecto se están realizando una serie de entrevistas a personas que han trabajado la perspectiva de género desde diferentes ámbitos de la salud laboral. En esta ocasión tenemos el honor de presentar la entrevista a Karen Messing, una de las pioneras más destacadas en investigar la relación entre salud y trabajo y los diferentes efectos en la salud según el género. Karen Messing es ergónoma e investigadora del CINBIOSE, del que es también cofundadora. Además es profesora emérita en el Departamento de Ciencias Biológicas de la Universidad de Quebec, en Montreal, Canadá. Ha recibido varios reconocimientos, entre ellos el Premio del Gobernador General de Canadá por contribuir al bienestar de las mujeres en el año 2009, y el premio William P. Young en el año 2014 de la Asociación Estadounidense de Higiene Industrial, por su aportación a esta disciplina. Es autora y coautora de más de 200 publicaciones, entre ellas varios libros sobre el género, salud y trabajo. En concreto, queremos destacar su publicación titulada Paint and Prejudice: What Science Can Learn About Work for the People Who Do It, del año 2014, donde describe la importancia de escuchar a los trabajadores y las trabajadoras sobre sus problemas de salud y bienestar en el trabajo. En español se puede encontrar El trabajo en las mujeres, comprender para transformar, del año 2002, sobre la invisibilidad del trabajo en las mujeres y donde se ofrecen elementos prácticos para mejorar sus condiciones de trabajo y salud. En el año 2021 también publica el libro Bent Out of Shape: Shame, Solidarity and Women's Bodies at Work, en el que desarrolla la respuesta ante la pregunta ¿deberían los lugares de trabajo tratar a todos los cuerpos por igual? Y en el que concluye que debemos atrevernos a dirigir la atención a los cuerpos de las mujeres, erradicar la vergüenza y transformar el lugar de trabajo, una tarea que concierne tanto a científicos como a políticos. Os dejamos pues ya con la entrevista, realizada por Rudolf van der Haar, jefe de los servicios de condiciones ambientales de MC Mutual, y esperamos que os resulte tan interesante como a nosotros.
We know that you have a long-standing experience in occupational health and related with the gender. But when did you get interested in this topic, or what was the cause of the reason that you started working in this field?
What I should explain first is that my university has an unusual positioning, which is that there is a special service at the university devoted to relations with the community and with community organizations. And that service signed an agreement with Quebec's major trade unions. And the agreement says that if the unions need information, research, or training courses, they can ask the university for resources. And the university will provide professors to give courses or to do research. And the money for that does not come from the unions. It's so that the researcher can be neutral in our approach. And so that enables us to get access to the knowledge of workers and of the community.
Okay.
And in that context, I was asked to do a research project on radiation due to my expertise in genetics. I have a PhD in genetics. And so I went to a factory and met a lot of men who were exposed to radiation and worked with them. And through that experience working about radiation, I was asked to do work with hospital workers who are also exposed to radiation. But when I met the hospital workers and talked to them about their work, it turned out that they were so exposed to so many other things, and they were treated with terrible disrespect as well. So given the experiences I had with the hospital workers, I then went to France and got retrained as an ergonomist, and became particularly interested in the exposures and difficulties experienced by women workers and the lack of respect that women workers experience. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I that's how I got involved with gender.
Yeah, yeah. So I would understand that the university at that time, or maybe still has some kind of extension program to the society.
Yes, there are actually now many of them, in the sense that the university will do research at the request of these unions with whom it has an agreement, but also there's a consortium of feminist groups that can also ask for research projects. And then there are environmentalist groups that can also ask for research projects. And it's really good for researchers because we get in touch with the most urgent, important questions and in touch with the people who know the most from the ground floor about these questions.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting. And well, you started in the 1980s or something like that with your research.
The first question that was asked to me was in 1978.
Yeah.
And then, yes, since then, I've been interested in occupational health and in occupational health of women workers.
Yeah. And now we are 2023. What do you think?
And why haven't I made everything better?
No, yeah. What is the progress? I mean, you're looking back in the past, and then you see, is there progress? Do you see that the gender is really now a topic which is taken into account in the occupational health business, or still a lot of things to do? How do you look back, and what do you think of the situation?
It's much better than it was, and well, I'll divide that into what is the science doing, what state is the science at, and then talk about as far as workers are concerned. As far as the science is concerned, it's been shown that there's a certain amount of progress. At the time when I started, there was really no research on women. Women were pretty much excluded from scientific studies of occupational health. Women's occupational cancers were not studied. Women's other occupational diseases. There are many studies that show that there was no scientific work on this. There has been some areas in which there are more studies, although certainly not equaling studies on men. And there are some areas, for example, toxicology, where there's very, very, very little work, scandalously little work. In the area of solvents, my colleague Donna Mergler has looked at this, and almost all studies either exclude women workers or don't treat their data appropriately. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that when you have data on both men and women, you have to figure out how you're going to treat those data. Are you going to just treat everybody as if they were the same and do statistical tricks to make the women look more like men so you can treat them the same way? Yeah. And we've showed that that's not appropriate, that you really have to think about men and women as if they have different exposures. And the reason for that is that when you study the effects of, say, repetitive work, you're going to ask the question, if men and women do repetitive work, do they have musculoskeletal disorders? Do they have pain? Do they have disabilities? But when you do that, you are assuming that the word repetitive work means the same thing in men's jobs and women's jobs. But the same words don't refer to the same reality in men's jobs and women's jobs, because men do repetitive work, but it's likely to involve heavier weights, but slower work, fewer repetitions. And women tend to make these little tiny movements. And very fast, and they're associated with different musculoskeletal disorders. So I'm not saying women's problems are worse than men's. Men are exposed to terrible things and very dangerous things because people don't hesitate as much to expose men to terrible, dangerous things. And they give women what look like easy safe jobs, except they're not always.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of deep thinking about statistics is becoming more and more necessary as we realize that it's not just women who are different in the workplace. What about people who are racialized, people who have suffered other kinds of discrimination?
Yeah.
And what do you do statistically with a population that has several sources of oppression? And so we've been thinking a lot about the statistics aspects of this, and we are not the only people doing that.
No.
Well, there's progress, but we certainly are not getting where we should be yet. So
No.
that's from the point of view of science. From the point of view of the workers themselves, the same damn problems that people had in 1978 are still with us. Domestic workers are still badly treated, terribly oppressed. There's still sexual harassment on the job. Women still have a hard time doing jobs, entering jobs where there haven't been women before. And the kinds of exposures that women have in their jobs, like the very fast repetition, or in North America, we have a terrible problem with prolonged standing. People in North America think that if you are a service worker, if you are a cashier or a receptionist, you should be standing. And those are women's jobs. And it's prolonged standing without moving, which is associated with all kinds of cardiovascular symptoms and musculoskeletal symptoms. And we have been unable to get those removed from the workplace. So there is progress in some senses, in the sense that women's committees in the unions have been doing a lot of work, but there is not the kind of progress I would like to see.
And concerning the legislation, I mean, do you think there's progress made in terms of legislation as well, or still?
That's a good question for me, because we have just changed the laws in Quebec. So we have a broad health and safety law in Quebec, and it has a lot of good things about it. One of the good things, and I'll say that at the beginning, is that we have had in 1979 what was a very innovative law about pregnancy, which was that a pregnant woman exposed to a danger for herself or her fetus, or if she was nursing a baby for the baby who was nursing, could request to have her working conditions temporarily changed. And if this wasn't possible, then she could be sent home for the duration of the pregnancy or the duration of the danger, whichever was less.
Yeah.
And this was very helpful for two reasons. One, of course, was for the pregnant women, because about 30% of pregnant women took advantage of this legislation, but also for the health and safety committees who had never thought about dangers in women's work before. It was a very important tool for them to understand the dangers in women's work.
Yeah.
And of course, the employers didn't like it very much, because they kept saying it had nothing to do with work and it should be part of social legislation. And the people replied, no, when there is a working condition that's dangerous, you have to change the working condition. You can't just say, well, this worker should be taken away. So over the last 30 years, that's something that's helped get visibility for the dangers in women's jobs.
Yeah.
And the reason it's been kept is that there's been a broad coalition of public health physicians, of union people, of women scientists, and women's groups, that every time this is attacked, there's a broad coalition to defend it. And it's fairly easy to get the newspapers interested in protecting pregnant women as well. So that has been something that has been an improvement. The thing that was negative about the legislation in 1979 was that they based their priorities for prevention on the scientific literature existing in 1979, which, as I've mentioned, it has nothing about women. So that all the groups where women work were in areas at the lowest level of priority. And this was particularly striking during COVID because all the healthcare professions and anything involving hospital work was in the 6th group out of 6 for prevention. There was no health and safety committee. There was no health and safety representation. There were no places to discuss health and safety issues. So because of this, the coalition was requesting changes in the law in order to make it easier for everybody really to access prevention.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into all the technical details of the new law, but when they brought out the first draft of the new law, it was just as bad as the one before. And there was a big fight. And then in principle, it's been accepted that there will be a change in the priorities. So that was a major victory.
Okay.
Some of the other things that have become more important for us is the recognition of there are 2 areas where women report more health problems than men, more occupationally related health problems than men, aside from the reproductive ones. One is musculoskeletal disorders that are non-traumatic. That means that real accidents, those men suffer from much more than women, and fatalities, men suffer much from women, except for violence at the workplace, which is pretty much even. Physical violence. But women suffer more from non-traumatic musculoskeletal disorders, aches and pains related to work, and psychosocial oppression. Women suffer more than men. So to get those 2 things covered by the law has been a struggle, and there is some progress, and but it's not enough. And then some groups of workers were excluded either de facto or explicitly by the legislation, and getting domestic workers covered has been a struggle, and we've not succeeded completely. So I don't know if that's enough information about that, but I guess you get a portrait of where some things gotten better and some things haven't.
Just for your information, in Spain we have a similar legislation concerning pregnant women. If the risk you cannot be controlled, they can be sent home, or if the employee cannot find another place for them as well. I mean, so we have more or less the same legislation. The difficulties is, as far as I can see, how do you assess the real risk of a pregnant woman when they are working with in certain conditions, right? And how the weight of the load they have to carry, or the exposure to some kind of chemical. And then you have always the discussion: does it have an impact or not in the pregnancy, or because there's no information, or there's very little information about this issue. So, but it's nice to hear that in Canada is more or less in the same line. Then it's good to hear.
Actually, and you've put your finger on an important issue, which is who decides what's dangerous for the pregnant women. And we've been arguing that it should be the person's physician in consultation with the woman who decides. And in the previous law, the physician had to consult a public health expert, but it was the physician who decided. And now there's it's being fought out in terms of regulations right now, because you can't really make a list of all conditions that are difficult for pregnant women, because there's too much. As an ergonomist, it's the interaction between the person and their position. That's why we wanted the physician to do it, because they know what's happening with the woman. You can't just decide based on the environment. So it's an interaction, but we'll see what happens. We don't know the answer yet.
Yeah. Okay. Nice to hear. Anyway, and now looking at the future, we have looking back and then now looking at the future. What do you think? What are the most relevant issues to tackle in a short period. I mean, what should be focused on? I mean, do you have some suggestions or ideas, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends if I talk locally, then there are some issues. For example, a lot of people in both in North America and in Europe are now working with telework.
Yeah.
And what should be done to make telework safer. And there are all kinds of issues with there's the in Europe, some people have the right to not be connected to I don't know what it's called in English. In French, it's le droit à la déconnexion.
Yeah, the right to be disconnected.
The right to be disconnected,
yeah.
And we don't have enough rights to disconnect. There's also the question of the employer's responsibility if there is violence at home, and the employer in our new legislation has a duty to combat conjugal violence in the workplace setting, and as far as it's affected by and affects the workplace setting. But if the workplace setting is the home, then it becomes very complicated. So there's all those issues, but then there's just the very, very much broader and most important issue, which is respect for women in the workplace. And that's not just in terms of sexual harassment, but really sexist harassment, all the little jokes people make about women, the fact that women are treated with enough disrespect that we become ashamed of ourselves, and therefore ashamed to ask for things, and ashamed to have pain because somebody's going to say, yes, women are always complaining, and ashamed to say that a job is too difficult, or that their workplace should be adapted because the fault is put on the woman and not on the work environment. So there's a whole question worldwide about the respect for women workers. And of course, in some areas of the world, it's a horrible, horrible situation when we think of the migrant workers who are working as domestics in Qatar or places like that, and or Canada sometimes, who are treated terribly. So there's enough work to keep us researchers going for quite a while, I think.
Yeah. And well, I suppose that I read some some pages from your book, from the Bent Out of Shape. So I understand that more or less that you're also that you also have written in the book, right? That women are ashamed of themselves, or they are not. They have difficulties to express themselves or to fight for their rights. So that's also, I think, a very interesting.
Well, I think if you treat somebody badly enough for long enough, they start to internalize it, and they start to think that it's their fault. And we women have, and people who are racialized and migrants are often told that when we feel some problem in the work, the problem is not in the work, the problem is in us. And also women are taught that women's functions are somehow shameful, so that if women have, for example, pain during their menstrual periods, and this pain is exacerbated by the working conditions, we're taught not to tell anybody about this because it's shameful. So and that's why it's so important for women to talk to other women, because if you're sharing these things and all of a sudden you realize, well, everybody's got this problem, it's not me, then that's better. Yeah.
And related to this, I'm not sure what you're thinking about, but the combination of working and doing the households. I think, well, my impression is always that women are still in charge of the housekeeping and et cetera, and also doing work. That combination, the stress, which also might provoke this combination of issues. So that, I don't know what's your.
Well, they because historically men have been more frequent in the paid workforce, there has been, it's been accepted that there would be a complete separation between the work sphere and the home sphere, and that it's not legitimate to bring anything from the home into the workspace. But as women have come into the workforce, it's become obvious that there are many interfaces between the work sphere and the home sphere, and that interface is determined not just by what happens at home, but it's determined by what happens at work. So for one example is work schedules. I don't know about Europe, but here in Canada, the employer feels able to invade the home sphere at all times with the work schedule. You can give somebody a work schedule that changes every week with only 2 days or 3 days notice of the work schedule. And the work schedule can vary. For example, for call centers, it can vary on call volume, so that a person will be asked to work on Monday from 6 to 2, Tuesday from 12 to 9, Thursday, they'll have Wednesday for their free day, and then Thursday they'll work some other hours, and that changes every week. So if you have children, the interface becomes impossible to manage. And we've documented this in several kinds of jobs. But it's not the woman's problem of balancing work and family. It's really this concept that the work sphere is completely able to do whatever it wants to invade the home sphere. The workplace, for example, can make it impossible for you to telephone your family, or for your family to telephone you in an emergency. And there's no laws that we have anyway that say that the work sphere has to permit a person to do the necessary tasks involved with being a real person outside of work.
Yeah.
And in the telework situation, of course, it's even more complicated.
Yeah, yeah. So I can hear there's still a lot of things to do.
Yes.
So you cannot retire, Karen.
Well, I retired in 2008, but it doesn't seem to be
but still
happening.
working.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you very much for this interview.